Before we say I do, I need to tell you something." The room froze. Edward Langston stood under the golden lights of the cathedral hall, gripping the microphone like a lifeline. His tie loosened, hands trembling. "I've lost everything. The money, the houses, it's all gone." Gasps rippled through the guests, and Claire, she didn't move. She just stared at him, eyes wide, heart unreadable. Moments before Edward's voice broke the silence, everything looked perfect. Hundreds of white orchids draped the altar. Crystal chandeliers bathed the marble floor in warm light. Guests whispered about the elegance, the wealth, the fairy tale. But inside Edward, it wasn't magic. It was panic. For weeks, he had been hiding the truth. A collapse in his investment firm, a storm of lawsuits, everything crumbling. He could have kept quiet, said nothing, married Claire and pretended. But standing in front of her, watching her walk down that aisle with so much trust in her eyes, he couldn't do it. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the edge of a cliff, and he was jumping. He didn't know how Claire would react. He just knew he couldn't keep living a lie. What happened next would test the meaning of love, legacy, and what remains when everything else is gone. Edward Langston wasn't born into money. He was born into pressure. His father built the Langston name from the ground up: real estate, venture capital, political ties. But with success came expectation. Edward was the golden son, the Ivy League prodigy who doubled the family fortune before turning 30. To the world, he was confident, charming, untouchable. But behind the tailored suits and confident handshakes, Edward lived in fear. Fear of failing, fear of being ordinary, fear of not living up to the weight of his last name. Then came Claire Whitmore. She wasn't like the women he usually met at fundraisers or boardrooms. She asked real questions. She laughed at her own jokes. She never cared about his money, or so he believed. With her, he didn't have to pretend. They fell fast. Dinners turned into weekends, weekends into plans. And when he proposed beneath a lantern-lit sky in Napa, she said yes without hesitation. But not everyone celebrated. Claire's parents, Richard and Margaret Whitmore, came from old money. They valued tradition, security, and control. Richard, especially, saw Edward as a risk, too ambitious, too volatile, too emotional. Still, Claire believed in him. And for a while, that belief gave Edward strength. But then the numbers began to shift. One startup collapsed, then another. A lawsuit he thought would go away suddenly didn't. Investors pulled out, markets tightened, and Edward, instead of asking for help, doubled down. Sold assets, borrowed privately, hid the damage. He kept smiling, kept planning the wedding, kept pretending he was the man Claire had fallen in love with, when in truth he was unraveling. Every night he rehearsed the same lie: "It's just a rough patch, it'll bounce back." But as the ceremony approached and the debt piled higher, the lie became too heavy. He could feel it every time Claire touched his hand. She trusted him, and he wasn't being honest. The morning of the wedding, staring at his reflection, Edward knew he couldn't carry the mask into their vows. And so, at the altar, with 1,000 eyes watching, he chose the truth. For a long time, Edward believed he was building a dream. Not just a business empire, but a future, one where he and Claire would travel the world, raise children in a lakeside home, host dinners under string lights, and never worry about money. He pictured a life where love and legacy could exist side by side. In the early days, that dream felt unstoppable. A new fintech startup he backed had tripled in value overnight. An aggressive real estate move in Austin paid off beyond projections. Magazines called him the next Branson. His father finally looked at him with pride instead of pressure. And Claire, she glowed beside him, always present, always kind, grounding him when his mind raced with numbers and strategies. When they chose the venue for their wedding, he spared no expense. The Langstons didn't do small, not for their only son, but success is fragile. It began with a single phone call. A partner, someone Edward had trusted since college, was under investigation for insider trading. Then came the chain reaction. A client pulled out of a multi-million-dollar deal. A competitor launched a smear campaign online. The press pounced. The market turned cold. Banks froze his assets pending audits. Investors panicked. And within weeks, Edward watched his empire, brick by golden brick, start to fall. He worked tirelessly, barely sleeping. He was convinced he could fix it. Sell this, liquidate that, refinance another. But it was like plugging holes in a sinking ship with his bare hands. He told Claire none of it, not when he sold his downtown condo, not when he let go of half his team, not when his father called and coldly said, "You're on your own now." He couldn't bear the look of disappointment. He couldn't risk losing the only person who made him feel whole outside of a spreadsheet. Instead, he kept pretending, wore the same suit, smiled the same smile, made the same toast at their rehearsal dinner, his voice steady while his hands shook under the table. And then came the night before the wedding. Alone in the hotel suite, surrounded by silence and champagne bottles no one had opened, Edward finally broke. He stared at his reflection for hours, feeling like a fraud in a tuxedo. He could marry Claire and keep lying. She'd never know, at least not yet. Or he could tell her the truth and risk watching her walk away. The morning of the wedding, Edward didn't eat. He couldn't. Every cell in his body screamed for escape. He rehearsed a dozen lies, just enough truth to buy time, just enough charm to keep things from falling apart. But when he saw Claire walking toward him down the aisle, something inside him broke. Her eyes were filled with such calm joy, such certainty, and he was hollow. He realized in that instant that marrying her under false pretenses wouldn't just be dishonest, it would be cruel. So he stopped everything. "I have to say something," he whispered to the officiant, who stepped aside, confused. He turned to Claire. His voice trembled. "I'm sorry, but before we make these vows, there's something you deserve to know." And then he said it. Every word like glass in his throat. "I lost everything." At first, silence, then whispers, then gasps. Claire's expression froze, her bouquet slowly lowering, her lips parting but no words coming out. Edward felt his heart shatter. The weight he'd carried for months collapsed all at once, leaving him bare and breathless. He looked down, waiting for the rejection, the judgment, the silence, but Claire didn't storm off. She didn't cry, she just stood there. Seconds passed, then minutes, and that's when the room began to turn. The guests, once dazzled by luxury and spectacle, now wore faces of unease. Some exchanged glances, others pulled out their phones. A few walked out, but the worst came from the front row. Claire's father, Richard, stood up slowly. His jaw clenched, eyes sharp. "This is outrageous," he said coldly. "You bring my daughter into this circus, humiliate her in front of everyone." Claire tried to speak, but he held up a hand. "He's nothing now," Richard continued, voice rising. "No money, no business, no future. And you want to tie yourself to that?" Margaret, her mother, stood beside him, silent but visibly shaken. Her disappointment radiated from every careful movement. Edward remained frozen. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, to fight back, but he felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. He turned to Claire, barely able to meet her gaze. "I didn't tell you because I was scared," he said, voice breaking. "Not of failing, but of losing you. And now, maybe I've lost you anyway." Claire's eyes filled, not with tears, but something deeper. Conflict, pressure, fear, and beneath it, something else. A flicker of resolve. But she said nothing. Not yet. After the ceremony was suspended, the room slowly emptied. The flowers, the string quartet, the golden light, it all seemed ridiculous now. Hollow. Like a stage set after the actors had gone home. Back in the bridal suite, Claire sat alone, still in her dress, staring at her reflection. She had dreamed of this day since she was a child, and now it lay in ruins at her feet. But the pain she felt wasn't betrayal. It was the pressure, the weight of her parents' expectations, the whispers of her friends, the voice in her own head asking, Are you really going to throw away your future for a man who failed? But another voice was rising too, quieter, steadier. Or are you going to choose the only thing that's ever felt real? She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew the question mattered. And you? Have you ever stood at a crossroads where every option hurt and silence felt safer than the truth? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes the weight we carry only becomes lighter when we dare to speak it out loud. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear. Right now, Claire didn't leave the suite for hours. The makeup on her face had begun to smudge. Her bouquet rested on the floor, untouched. Outside, murmurs faded into silence. The guests were gone. The fairy tale had ended, but inside her, something unexpected was unfolding. She thought back to the first night she met Edward, before the champagne, before the headlines. He had taken her to a bookstore instead of a restaurant. They sat on the floor between shelves, talking for hours about childhood fears and broken dreams. That version of him wasn't flashy. He was curious, humble, a little nervous, and completely real. Somewhere along the way, the world had demanded they become symbols of status, of power, of perfect love. But what they truly shared had never been built on wealth. It had been built on vulnerability. On the way, he listened when she talked about her mother's quiet sadness. On the way, she instinctively knew when his confidence was just armor. She realized then, Edward hadn't betrayed her. He had trusted her, enough to fall apart in front of her. And she? She had stayed silent, caught between expectations and instinct. Claire rose slowly from the chair. The dress felt heavier now, but her steps were lighter. Down the hallway, she found Edward sitting alone in the empty reception hall, his tie undone, his eyes lost somewhere far away. He didn't see her at first. "Edward," she said softly. He turned. No defenses, just raw exhaustion. "I understand why you didn't tell me," she continued, "but you should have." "I know," he whispered. "I was just so afraid." Claire took a breath. "I was too." Then she walked toward him. Not as a bride, not as someone choosing between love and logic, but as herself. And when she reached him, she sat beside him in the silence. Neither said the word forgiveness, but something shifted. The foundation hadn't been destroyed, it had just been buried, waiting for the truth to uncover it. The day after the wedding that wasn't, Claire and Edward didn't run away. They packed 2 duffel bags and drove up the coast in silence, leaving behind the mansion, the chaos, the voices. They rented a small cabin near Mendocino. No internet, no press, no expectations. Just them, the trees, and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. For the first time in months, Edward slept, and when he woke, Claire was there. No makeup, no veil. Just her, reading on the porch, barefoot, wrapped in a blanket. They talked. Not about rescue plans or PR strategies. They talked about fear, about shame, about the lies they told themselves before the lies they told each other. Edward admitted that he didn't know who he was without the empire. Claire admitted that a part of her had been afraid of losing the lifestyle she never asked for, but had grown comfortable in. And slowly they started to rebuild, not the fortune, but the foundation. Edward called the one investor who hadn't abandoned him and asked for advice, not money. Claire began writing again, something she hadn't done in years, rediscovering a part of herself she thought she'd buried beneath expectations. They ate pasta from the pot, took walks without phones, laughed at the absurdity of it all. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't impressive, but it was real. Every small moment they shared now felt like a quiet rebellion against the version of success they'd been taught to worship. The world thought they'd broken, but the truth was, they were beginning again. But healing isn't linear. 2 weeks after their retreat, reality came knocking, in the form of headlines, voicemails, and silence from family. Richard Whitmore hadn't spoken to Claire since the wedding. Margaret sent one message: "Call us when you're ready to come back to your senses." Claire felt it like a slow pull on her spine, the urge to explain, to justify, to please. Edward felt it too. in his inbox, flooded with legal notices and final demands. The media hadn't moved on. In fact, the public spectacle had only grown. Now, his fall from grace had its own hashtag. One night, after receiving a rejection from a consulting firm he'd admired for years, Edward snapped, "I'm just tired of being the guy who failed," he said, pacing the room. Claire watched him, quiet. "You're not the guy who failed," she said gently. "You're the guy who's still here." But he didn't believe it. Not yet. The next morning, she found him staring at their dwindling bank account. His fingers hovered over a button, "Apply for bridge loan." She closed the laptop. "No shortcuts," she said. "Not again." Edward nodded, but his hands were shaking. They fought that week, over money, over doubt, over whether love could survive when hope seemed thin. But they also kept showing up. They began budgeting, applying for grants, considering co-living spaces. Humbling, yes, but necessary. One afternoon, Claire submitted a short story to a small online magazine. 3 days later, it was accepted. She cried, not because it was prestigious, but because it was hers. That same week, Edward was invited to speak at a local college, not as a success story, but as a cautionary tale. He almost declined, but Claire looked him in the eyes and said, "They don't need your perfection, they need your truth." And so, with a shaky voice and an open heart, Edward told a room full of strangers how it feels to lose everything and still choose to try again. The day Richard Whitmore called, Claire almost didn't answer. It had been nearly 2 months since the wedding. 2 months of silence, of shame, wrapped in parental concern, coated in cold disapproval. But now, his voice on the line was calm, controlled. "Claire," he said, "I'd like to speak with Edward, alone." Edward sat across from her, eyes cautious. He nodded. The next afternoon, they met at Richard's office. High-rise, corner floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city Edward used to rule. Richard didn't offer coffee, just a seat. "I've been watching," he began. "The interviews, the college talks. Your humility." Edward nodded once, unsure where this was going. "I'm offering you a way back," Richard said. "I've spoken to some contacts. There's capital available, enough to rebuild, faster than what you're doing now." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I believe in potential," Richard replied, "and because Claire still believes in you. But there's a condition." Edward knew. Of course there was. "You'll take the money," Richard continued, "but you will step back from Claire, publicly. End it clean. Let her return to the life she deserves. This rebuilding, it's not for her." Edward didn't speak for a long time. He remembered the headlines, the humiliation, the weight of being a disappointment. He also remembered Claire's hand closing the laptop on the loan page, the sound of her typing that short story late into the night, the way she stood beside him when he had nothing to offer but honesty. He looked Richard in the eye. "No." Richard blinked. "No," he repeated, almost amused. Edward stood. "I won't trade her love for a shortcut. Not again. I've done that once. With money, with image, with pretending. I lost everything that mattered. I'm not doing it twice." He paused, then added quietly, "If Claire wants to leave, she can, but it won't be because I sold her off to buy my way back." Richard didn't respond, just stared as Edward walked out. Back at the cabin, Edward told Claire everything. She listened, quiet, and when he finished, she walked over, placed her forehead gently against his chest and whispered, "That's the man I said yes to." That night, they sat outside, wrapped in blankets, watching the sky. They were still in debt, still uncertain, still figuring it out. But something had shifted. Edward no longer feared being seen. Claire no longer feared choosing him. The following month, Edward launched a podcast, The Fall and the Fight, where he interviewed others who had lost everything and found something deeper. It didn't go viral, but it reached people. Claire's story was published in print. A literary agent contacted her, asking if she had more. She smiled. She had plenty. Together they weren't rich. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time their lives felt theirs, Not a performance, not a brand, just two people side by side, building something honest from the ruins. Years later, no one remembered the headlines. The scandal faded. The wedding that never happened became a quiet story, tucked away in a corner of memory. But what remained was something far more lasting. Edward and Claire eventually moved into a modest home just outside Santa Rosa. No gates, no staff, just a garden Claire loved and a small office where Edward recorded his interviews. Their life was no longer defined by deals closed or appearances kept. It was defined by quiet mornings, shared meals, and hard conversations that didn't end in silence. When Edward was invited to speak at a conference titled Redefining Success, he hesitated, not because he doubted his story, but because he finally understood it. On stage, he said something he'd never written, never rehearsed. "I thought failure was the end, but it was the invitation to live without masks, to love without performance, to be seen and still be chosen." That was the lesson. They hadn't rebuilt the empire, but they'd built something real. Claire published her first book 2 years later. In the dedication she wrote, "To the man who taught me that falling can be the beginning of flight." And Edward, looking at her from the back of the room, smiled, because he knew now, the richest life isn't the one with the biggest numbers. It's the one you can live with your whole heart. Edward and Claire's story reminds us that sometimes rock bottom isn't a failure, it's a foundation, a place where the noise fades, the masks fall, and what's left is real. Have you ever faced a moment where everything collapsed and you had to decide who you were without the titles, without the safety net? Tell me in the comments. Your story might be the lifeline someone else is waiting for. And if this journey moved you, if it made you feel something, leave a like. It helps more stories like this reach the people who need them most. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe in stories that go beyond the surface. Stories about truth, about love that stays, and about finding your worth when the world tells you you've lost it. Because the next one might be the story you didn't know you needed to hear.